The first shots after the silence. On a summer night in 1954, in Geneva, negotiations stretched deep into exhaustion. The air inside the conference room was thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Ceiling fans turned slowly, doing little to dispel the sense that the decisions being made here would not bring peace. Only a pause. Spread across the tables were maps of a long, narrow country of jungles and rivers. Vietnam. Pencils traced and retraced a horizontal line across the page at the 17th parallel. On paper, it was described as temporary. Not a border, not a permanent division. At least, that was the language used. Everyone in the room understood the truth. Once a line is drawn, it rarely disappears. France left the table knowing its colonial war was finished. The guns had fallen silent, but silence did not mean resolution. It meant vacuum, and vacuums, in the Cold War, never remained empty for long. 9 years earlier, in the autumn of 1945, tens of thousands had gathered in Hanoi's Ba Jin Square. They carried no weapons, only expectation. On the platform stood Ho Chi Minh, thin, composed, deliberate. When he began to speak, he did not quote Marx or Lenin. All men are created equal. He was quoting the American Declaration of Independence. It was no accident. Ho understood symbolism. He understood history. And he understood the audience he hoped was listening across the Pacific. Vietnam was not merely declaring independence. It was asking to be recognized. But the post-war world was not governed by ideals. It was governed by power. Within months, French forces returned. Negotiations collapsed. War resumed. For 8 brutal years, jungles and villages became battlefields. The cost was measured not only in lives, but in the slow erosion of hope that freedom could be won quickly or cleanly. When Viet Minh artillery shattered the French stronghold at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, it was more than a military defeat. It marked the collapse of an old order. France left Indochina behind, but it did not leave behind stability. It left a question: who would control Vietnam? In Washington, that question was never framed in Vietnamese terms. It was viewed through China, where Mao Zedong had just triumphed, through Korea, still bleeding, through Eastern Europe, already sealed behind the Iron Curtain. A concept began to dominate every security briefing: the Domino Theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, Laos would follow. Then Cambodia, then Thailand, perhaps all of Southeast Asia. In this logic, Vietnam was no longer a nation seeking its own future. It became a front line. In the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power, building a socialist state with growing support from China and the Soviet Union. In the south, a fragile government formed around Ngo Dinh Diem, a man Washington believed could hold the line against communism without requiring American troops. Catholic, nationalist, uncompromising. Diem canceled the nationwide elections scheduled for 1956. He knew he would lose them. Washington knew it too, and Washington accepted it. In the Cold War, democracy often came second to strategy. The division hardened, quietly, irrevocably. Beyond Saigon, government authority faded quickly. Corruption spread. Land reform stalled. Old resentments resurfaced. In rural villages, dissatisfaction turned into quiet resistance. Communist cadres returned patiently, deliberately, first with words, then with organization, then with weapons. By the early 1960s, they called themselves the National Liberation Front. The world would know them as the Viet Cong. This was still not America's war, but America was already everywhere. When John F. Kennedy entered the White House, He inherited a Vietnam sliding toward collapse. He did not want a full-scale war. He believed in controlled escalation, military advisors, financial aid, helicopters, technology. No declaration, no invasion. A proxy war managed. But war does not follow briefing slides. Huey helicopters carried American troops into jungle landing zones. Officially, they were not combat soldiers. In practice, they were fighting. Reports spoke of progress. Journalists saw something else entirely. When Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and assassinated in 1963, with tacit American approval, the fragile structure collapsed. South Vietnam entered a cycle of coups. Washington lost any illusion of a stable partner. 3 weeks later, Kennedy was assassinated. Vietnam passed into the hands of Lyndon B. Johnson. In the summer of 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, ambiguity became policy. Radar contacts, conflicting reports. Torpedoes fired, or not. The details would be debated for decades. The consequence was immediate. Congress granted the president sweeping authority to use military force in Vietnam. No declaration of war, no limits, no exit strategy, only escalation. When U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang in 1965, all pretense ended. This was no longer a managed proxy conflict. It was America's war, even if it was never formally declared. Bombs fell on the north. Soviet and Chinese weapons flowed south. American pilots were shot down. Prisoners were taken. The superpowers avoided direct confrontation. The Vietnamese did not have that luxury. Somewhere in the jungle, a young American infantryman strained to hear movement in the trees. In Hanoi, planners prepared for a long war. In Washington, decisions were made under the belief that just a little more pressure would finally break the enemy. But Vietnam was not a test of will. It was a trap. And the United States had stepped inside. The Marines at Da Nang come ashore in March 1965 under a sky bleached white by heat and salt. There are no enemy soldiers waiting on the beach. No gunfire, no resistance. Cameras capture the moment anyway. Young men wading through shallow surf, rifles held high, helmets glinting in the sun. It looks calm. That illusion will not last. What follows is not a single decision, but a chain of them. Each justified as temporary, each described as necessary, each making the next one inevitable. Vietnam does not explode into total war overnight. It tightens slowly until there is no space left to step back. Lyndon B. Johnson tells himself, this will be measured, controlled. He has a great society to build at home. He does not want Vietnam to define his presidency. He insists the United States will apply just enough pressure to force Hanoi to negotiate, not enough to provoke China or the Soviet Union into open war. It is a familiar Cold War logic, and it will fail. The bombing begins first. Operation Rolling Thunder is designed as a message, not a knockout blow. American planners believe North Vietnam can be coerced, that pain, applied gradually and predictably, will bend political will. Targets are chosen carefully. Rail lines, bridges, depots, each strike approved through layers of bureaucracy reaching all the way to the White House. Pilots fly the same routes, at the same altitudes, week after week. The North Vietnamese learn quickly. Anti-aircraft guns thicken the skies around Hanoi and Haiphong. Soviet-made Se-2 surface-to-air missiles rise like spears. Radar locks on. Warning tones scream in cockpits. Aircraft explode mid-air. Parachutes bloom, or don't. Captured pilots are marched through streets, paraded for cameras. Some will spend years in prison camps. Others will not survive at all. Rolling Thunder does not break North Vietnam. It hardens it. On the ground in the south, the war expands just as relentlessly. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American troops are in Vietnam. A year later, there are over 400,000. Eventually, the number will pass 500,000. They arrive with overwhelming firepower. They do not arrive with clarity. The enemy does not wear uniforms consistently. The front lines do not stay put. Villages that appear friendly by day may shelter Viet Cong units by night. Every tree line becomes suspect. Every farmer might be a scout. Commanders measure success with rosters, body counts, a metric that rewards destruction without necessarily producing control. Villages are cleared, then abandoned. The Viet Cong return as soon as the Americans leave. The war becomes circular. In November 1965, in the Ye Drang Valley, East, the conflict shows its true face. U.S. Army units of the 1st Cavalry Division, newly converted to helicopter mobility, collide with regular North Vietnamese Army forces. This is no guerrilla skirmish. It is a conventional battle fought with modern weapons, fought face to face. Helicopters ferry troops into landing zones under fire. Artillery pounds surrounding hills. Airstrikes fall dangerously close to friendly lines. Casualties are heavy on both sides. American commanders claim victory. North Vietnamese commanders claim proof. They have fought the Americans directly and survived. The war will be long. By 1966 and 1967, Vietnam is saturated with firepower. B-52 bombers flatten jungle and countryside alike. Agent Orange strips forests bare, poisoning land and people for generations. Napalm turns villages into infernos. Yet Hanoi does not collapse. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast, shifting network of paths through Laos and Cambodia, continues to feed men and supplies southward. Bombing intensifies. So does repair. For every bridge destroyed, another is built. For every truck lost, more appear. The logic of attrition cuts both ways. At home, the war begins to fracture American society. Television brings the conflict into living rooms. Burning villages, wounded soldiers, body bags zipped shut. Reporters no longer rely solely on official briefings. They show what they see. Protests grow. Students march. Veterans speak out. Draft cards burn. The government insists progress is being made. The public sees no end. Then, in January 1968, the war detonates psychologically. During Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a period traditionally marked by ceasefires, Communist forces launch a coordinated nationwide offensive. Cities across South Vietnam erupt in fighting. Even the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon is breached. Militarily, the offensive is a failure for the Viet Cong. They suffer enormous losses. None of the uprisings they hope for materialize. But strategically, it is devastating for the United States. Because the war was never supposed to look like this, official assurances of imminent victory collapse overnight. Credibility, once lost, does not return. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American news, declares the war a stalemate. Johnson listens and understands. By March 1968, Lyndon Johnson announces he will not seek re-election. Vietnam has consumed his presidency after all. The war continues. But something fundamental has shifted. The United States is no longer trying to win decisively. It is trying to find a way out. The conflict does not end. It transforms. Richard Nixon enters the White House promising peace with honor. His strategy is called Vietnamization, turning the fighting over to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. At the same time, he expands the war. Bombing intensifies. Cambodia is struck secretly. Laos burns. The logic is brutally consistent. Apply maximum pressure while disengaging. The contradiction is never resolved. By the early 1970s, American troops are leaving. But the war is not over. South Vietnam stands, heavily armed, politically fragile. North Vietnam waits, patient as ever. The superpowers still avoid direct confrontation. The proxy war continues to obey its rules. But the cost has already reshaped everything. Vietnam has shown the limits of proxy war, shown how easily indirect conflict becomes direct, shown how overwhelming power can still fail against endurance, legitimacy, and time. And it is not finished yet. By the early 1970s, the war no longer sounds the same. The constant thunder of American artillery fades. The skies, once crowded with helicopters and jet contrails, grow quieter. Bases that had swelled into small cities begin to shrink. Sandbags rot in the rain. Empty guard towers stand watch over nothing. The United States is leaving Vietnam, not in victory, not in defeat, but in stages, carefully choreographed, politically managed, emotionally unresolved. For the men still fighting on the ground, the change is unsettling. South Vietnamese soldiers now carry the weight of battles that American units once shouldered. They receive more weapons, more equipment, more training. Their uniforms improve. Their firepower increases. Their confidence does not. They know what many in Washington prefer not to say aloud. This war has always depended on American presence. Remove it, and the structure begins to wobble. Vietnamization, as a policy, looks logical on paper. In reality, it is a race against time. In Paris, negotiations drag on in parallel with the fighting. Delegations meet in hotel rooms and conference halls, arguing over language, over sequencing, over who must concede first. The talks stretch into years, stalled by mistrust and calculation. Hanoi understands something crucial. Time is on its side. Every month that passes weakens American resolve. Every protest back home tightens political constraints. Every troop withdrawal shifts the balance subtly but decisively. North Vietnam does not need to win immediately. It only needs to endure. In the spring of 1970, the war expands again, quietly, then explosively. American and South Vietnamese forces cross into Cambodia, targeting sanctuaries used by North Vietnamese units. The operation is meant to buy time, disrupt supply lines, prove strength. Instead, it ignites fury at home. Campuses erupt. Demonstrations swell. And at Mostekio, Kent State University, National Guard troops fire into a crowd of students. 4 are killed. Vietnam has crossed an invisible boundary. It is no longer just a distant war. It is a domestic crisis. By now, the proxy nature of the conflict is fully exposed. The Soviet Union and China continue to supply North Vietnam weapons, training, intelligence. They do not send armies. They do not fight openly. They do not need to. America bleeds alone. In 1972, North Vietnam launches the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional assault using tanks, artillery, and regular army divisions. It is no longer guerrilla war. It is a test of whether South Vietnam can survive without American ground troops. The fighting is brutal. South Vietnamese units bend, but do not collapse. American air power returns in force. B-52s carpet bomb advancing formations. Cities are battered again. Civilian casualties mount. The message is clear. The war is not over, but neither side can decisively finish it. That same year, something else changes. Washington begins talking to Beijing, then to Moscow. The Cold War itself is shifting. Détente replaces confrontation. Strategic arms talks begin. Vietnam, once central, becomes inconvenient, a barrier to broader stability. Hanoi notices, so does Saigon. In January 1973, after years of negotiation, the Paris Peace Accords, Borken, Burhai are signed. The agreement promises what everyone wants to hear: a ceasefire, the return of prisoners, the withdrawal of American forces, a political process to determine Vietnam's future. American troops begin to leave in earnest. The last combat units depart quietly. No parades, no ceremonies, just planes lifting off, carrying men who will struggle for decades to explain what they fought for and why. The United States declares the war over. Vietnam does not. What follows is a pause filled with tension. South Vietnam remains armed, but isolated. American aid continues, but political will does not. Congress cuts funding, promises of support soften, then fade. North Vietnam rebuilds, repairs roads, moves supplies, waits. The Proxy War has entered its final phase. In the spring of 1975, the North strikes again. This time, there is no hesitation, no incremental pressure, no political signaling. The assault rolls south with speed and confidence. South Vietnamese units crumble faster than expected. Cities fall in succession. Refugees choke highways. Panic spreads upward through the chain of command. American advisors watch helplessly. There will be no return. In April, the war reaches its final, unbearable image. Helicopters lift off from rooftops in Saigon, evacuating the last Americans and a fraction of those who worked with them. Crowds press against embassy gates. Hands reach upward. Some make it out, most do not. As the final helicopter departs, the war that defined a generation ends. Not with triumph, but with exhaustion and loss. Vietnam is unified under communist rule. The cost is staggering. Millions dead. Cities shattered. Land poisoned. Families divided by ideology and memory. The Cold War moves on. But Vietnam leaves something behind. A lesson written in blood and time. It shows that proxy wars are not clean. That indirect conflict does not stay indirect. That overwhelming power cannot substitute for legitimacy. That time, patience, and endurance can defeat technology. And it proves something else. Something deeply unsettling for future superpowers. You can fight without declaring war. You can lose without surrendering. And you can leave without ever truly escaping. America will never fight the same way again. Neither will the Cold War. What Vietnam changed. The Proxy War, rewritten. When the guns fall silent in Vietnam, the Cold War does not pause to reflect. It absorbs the lesson, quietly, methodically, permanently. For in Washington, the reckoning is slow and deeply uncomfortable. There is no victory parade, no treaty signed aboard a battleship, no clear moment that signals closure. Instead, Vietnam lingers, in hearings, in memoirs, in arguments that refuse to end. Military planners study the war obsessively. What went wrong? What could have been done differently? How did the most powerful nation on earth fail to impose its will? The answers are never simple. Vietnam did not defeat the United States on the battlefield in the conventional sense. American forces won most engagements. Firepower dominated. Casualty ratios favored Washington, and yet the war was lost. Because Vietnam exposed a flaw at the heart of proxy conflict. Power can destroy, but it cannot persuade, and it cannot substitute for legitimacy. The United States emerges from Vietnam wary, not weaker in capability, but restrained in confidence. A new phrase enters military doctrine. No more Vietnams. Congress reasserts authority. The War Powers Act is passed. Presidents become more cautious, at least in theory. Future interventions will be limited. more indirect, more deniable. The lesson is not to avoid proxy war. It is to manage it better. Oh, for the Soviet Union, Vietnam is proof of patience. Moscow never sends armies, never risks nuclear confrontation, never takes formal responsibility. It supplies weapons, provides training, shares intelligence, and waits. The model works. The same logic will later appear in Afghanistan, with roles reversed. Proxy war is not about speed, it is about endurance. China draws its own conclusions. Vietnam confirms that national liberation movements, backed quietly and persistently, can defeat technologically superior opponents. But it also reveals the danger of dependency. Beijing will support proxies, but it will avoid entanglement. Vietnam becomes a reference point, not a template. Across the developing world, Vietnam echoes loudly. In Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, revolutionary movements study Hanoi's strategy. Insurgents memorize its patience. Governments fear its example. Superpowers adapt accordingly. They will fund. They will arm. They will advise. But they will rarely fight openly. Vietnam has taught them what direct engagement costs. For the American soldier, the war leaves scars that do not fade easily. Men return home to silence, to protest, to confusion. They struggle to explain a war without fronts, without victory, without clear meaning. Many never do. The military itself changes. Training evolves. Doctrine shifts. Professionalization deepens. The next wars will be different, but Vietnam will be in every one of them. For Vietnam, the end of war does not mean peace. Reunification brings hardship. Economic isolation follows. Re-education camps fill. Refugees flee by boat into an uncertain world. The country survives, but it pays for victory long after the fighting stops. The cost of proxy war is never paid only by proxies. And for the Cold War itself, Vietnam marks a turning point. After Vietnam, the superpowers understand the boundary more clearly. They will push. They will pressure. They will bleed each other indirectly. But they will step back from the brink, because Vietnam proved something terrifying. You can lose a war without ever losing a battle. You can fight for 20 years without ever declaring war. And you can destroy a country without ever truly winning it. Vietnam is not remembered as America's first proxy war. That title belongs to Korea. But Vietnam is where the illusion dies. The illusion that proxy wars are limited. The illusion that escalation can be controlled. The illusion that power guarantees outcome. From this point forward, every proxy conflict carries Vietnam's shadow. In jungles, in deserts, in cities reduced to rubble by forces that insist they are not at war. The Cold War continues, but it does so with caution, sharpened by failure. Vietnam does not end the Cold War. It teaches it how to survive, and in doing so, it ensures that proxy wars will remain one of the most dangerous and deceptive forms of conflict the modern world has ever known.